Welcome back. Well, people have been debating the idea of changing the United Nations almost since it was even founded. Independent groups such as the Centre for UN Reform and the World Federalist Movement track and propose UN reforms. Among them, getting rid of corruption and changing the UN structure. Calls for change also come from within. Member states such as the United States have proposed their own ideas for reform. And this month, Chile, South Africa, Thailand and Sweden banded together to present their ideas for reform of the UN. But the biggest push for change so far came when Kofi Annan took office in 1997. He appointed a panel to look into official reform. 8 years later, he presented the findings. The ideas echoed what many others want, an expanded Security Council and new rules on member states' use of force. However, none of those changes have been implemented. Well, some of the United Nations work is supervised by the Security Council of 15 members, some by the General Assembly with 192 members. The famous Blue Berets, or troops operating under the auspices of the UN, are placed by the Security Council and not the General Assembly. Unlike the Security Council, the General Assembly is not dominated by a small clique of countries, but represents the full membership of the UN. This gives it the credibility to oversee the UN's various humanitarian projects fairly. UNESCO, the UN's educational and cultural body, the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, and the World Food Programme all fall under the General Assembly's supervision. Well, we're still joined by our guests in New York, James Paul, Executive Director of the Global Policy Forum and a well-known speaker and writer on the UN and global policy issues. And in Amman, Jordan, Hassan Nafa, Professor of Political Science at Cairo University and Secretary General of the Arab Thought Forum based in Amman. Thank you both for being with us. If I could start with Professor Nafa. You were saying earlier in part one that power should be distributed more evenly amongst the UN and more power perhaps given to the General Assembly. Wouldn't that conflict with other demands for reform, namely efficiency? I mean, if you've got 192 bodies with more power, isn't that going to, or members with power, isn't that going to make decision making a lot more painful?
Of course, it is not easy to reform the United Nations. You have to have fair representation, but you have to have also an organization which is effective, so to conciliate representation with efficiency and also to distribution of power. So the reform of the United Nations has to be comprehensive. Expanding the Security Council only will not resolve the problem. You have to resolve also the problem of veto power. At the same time, you have to have a General Assembly that is more effective. I mean, you have to reorganize the method of debate and so on. Maybe you have to have another representation, not only one state, one vote, but you have to consider the representation of the world population in order to transform the General Assembly into a sort of world parliament, something like this. At the same time, you have to reorganize the International Court of Justice to make it more binding, to make its decisions more binding over the states, and to also to make the Security Council accountable to both the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice, and so on. So I think everyone is trying to focus on just one dimension of the reform. And in my humble opinion, I think if you don't have a comprehensive reform and you have a consensus, which is very difficult to achieve, you will not really be able to find a new, effective, truly democratic and representative organization.
Right. Is any of that possible? Sorry, Professor, but is any of that possible when you take into account the current funding structure of the UN, where it does seem like some of the world powers are the major contributors to the UN budget? Why on earth would they fund an organization that is no longer going to give them, you know, what they would consider to be what they deserve of power in this organization?
That's right, but you can always find ways to also reform the financial system. For example, some people propose to impose taxes on arms deal, for example, and you can finance the whole activities, the whole program of the United Nations in a much better way. So if you impose direct taxes, you will not see countries or states contributing too much, and 100 of the member states contributing only 1% of the finance. I think you have to revolutionize in a way to make it more revolutionary if you want to have an organization that is really effective in a globalized world, to have a real true world government in a way.
It's been said time and time again, Professor Hassan, simply get rid of the veto powers in the Security Council and get rid of consensus voting in the General Assembly. Is it that easy? And if so, why hasn't it been done?
No, both are very difficult, but it is easier to have consensus in the General Assembly, especially on social and economic issues. But it is much more difficult to eliminate or to avoid the veto. Each power and the permanent powers in the Security Council, each one is using the veto in a very abusive way. That is a real problem, and so you have to reform the decision-making mechanism in the Security Council, either to make it a little bit more difficult or to be more precise when and where a veto power should use its right in this. It is not very precise at all in the actual Charter of the United Nations, and it has to be totally reformed.
But Professor Hassan, even when it comes to the General Assembly, you said, yes, it's easier to get consensus. That's true in the General Assembly, but isn't that only at the price of the strength of the resolutions that the General Assembly can actually produce? I mean, 313, which I referred to, isn't that a prime example that the only thing they can agree on when talking about strengthening the authority and role of the General Assembly is to hold more debates, more discussions, and review annual reports?
Yes, you are right. It is not easy at all to have a consensus among 192 states, but the General Assembly has been able to achieve consensus on many issues. The question is whether the resolutions that are taken by the General Assembly could be implemented. This is the real issue, and I think because the General Assembly has no power, has no executive power, the only executive power lays in the hands of the Security Council. So you can reach a consensus, but it is difficult to implement the resolutions, even those who are taken by consensus.
All right, let's look at another aspect of proposals on reforming the General Assembly. Some say maybe the real issue is focusing what the General Assembly tackles. Do you think it tries to bite off too much than it can chew?
Yes, well, when you have an agenda of 162 items and every single state consider its own issues, its own problems, like the most important problems in the whole world, it is very difficult also to have a serious debate within the General Assembly. But as I already mentioned at the beginning, the distribution of power between the General Assembly and the Security Council is very much in favor of the Security Council. The General Assembly could discuss issues, but could not take real decisions. So you have hundreds and thousands of resolutions that have been taken by the General Assembly, but they could not be transformed into actions on the ground. The only body that can take decisions or have power to implement decisions is the Security Council. And even sometimes you do have a lot of resolutions taken by the Security Council and not implemented at all because they don't have a mechanism to be implemented. Look at the famous resolution 242 that is taken in 22, I think, November 1967 regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict. For 40 years, this resolution has not been implemented until now. because it has different interpretation by the different parties.
Let's say for a second, hypothetically, let's imagine we get to a stage, Professor Hassan, where the Security Council has been reformed or the General Assembly has been given more power, whatever. By the end of the day, you have other countries wielding more power and world powers perhaps wielding less power in the UN. Who would actually ensure the implementation of UN resolutions if world powers don't like them anymore? Aren't we back to square one, where you're dependent on world powers to provide the troops, to provide the money, for resolutions to actually be implemented on the ground?
Well, as a matter of fact, if you go back to the Charter of the United Nations, you will find some clauses that has never been entered into real life. Look at the Article 43, for example. The Article 43, if implemented, could provide the Security Council with an international army that could be used anytime.
Well, we are running out of time. We'll have to thank our guests, Professor Hassan Nafa from Cairo University and James Paul from Global Policy Forum. Unfortunately, we lost him earlier on. Thank you also, the viewer, for joining us here in this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.